Welcome to AppStories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Concepts and Linode. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is the editor-in-chief of MacStories.net, Mr. Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well, and I think you're doing all right, too. We've got a very special guest for AppStories today, don't we?
Yes, we do have a very special interview episode coming up here on AppStories. I was able to interview Apple's Senior Vice President of Software Engineering, Craig Federighi, about iPad and about iPadOS, about the new system Pointer. And it was a very good discussion. It was our second discussion here on AppStories. You may remember we were able to get Craig on the show last year during WWDC 2019. And I was able to talk to Craig again about iPadOS 13.4, which came out just a couple of months ago. And we talked about the new Pointer. We talked about the developer aspect of being able to, if you're a third-party developer and you want to support the Pointer, what that's like. And I think and I hope that it was a very good discussion. And so I'm very, very thankful to Apple for making this possible, especially now that we're all working from home and remote, and it was a whole thing to set up, right? And so I'm very thankful to them for this opportunity, and I hope that it was a good discussion. So we're gonna play that in a few minutes, John. But before we do that, I believe we want to address just a couple of quick things here on the show, right?
Yeah, we do. We want to remind everybody that we've got a brand new show out called MacStories Unwind, and that's a weekly show that we're doing every Friday, really short form, to do a rundown of everything that's happening at MacStories. What stories have we covered? What's the news been? Kind of your guide to the week, so you can go into the weekend knowing what happened, and if you've been busy, you can kind of pick and choose as to what you want to follow up on, because the show notes will have all sorts of links in them. Plus, Federico and I each week are doing a pick of some sort of media that we're enjoying. Last week we talked about a record album and a TV show, and this week who knows what we'll have, but we'll have something for everybody going into the weekend. And it's so far the response has been really great. People have told us that it's a great podcast to listen to while you're doing chores around the house or exercising or whatever it happens to be when you've got a little free time on a Saturday or Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a fun show to put together. I think the format really works right now, especially because we all have a lot of free time, and so having a few media recommendations to relax and unwind, something that we could all use right now. Honestly, I think it's definitely useful at this moment, given the current circumstances.
Yeah, we'll have a link into the show notes for that if you want to subscribe to the new show. And I also want to thank, right off the bat, one of our two sponsors for this show, and that's Concepts. And I'm really excited to have Concepts as a sponsor for this episode because it's the perfect complement to this episode because it's a great iPad app. Concepts is an infinite canvas app where ideas take shape. Its uses really are only limited by your imagination. It's a fully featured drawing and sketching app with an infinite canvas that works equally well for things like mind mapping, note-taking, storyboarding, graphic and product design, architectural planning, all sorts of things. The app has an incredibly deep catalog of customizable brushes, layer support, grid layouts, shape guides, and even scale features. And on top of that, it has a presentation mode and works with apps like Zoom and Reflector, so you can have an instant virtual whiteboard when you're stuck at home working. There are also a ton of export options. Download the app today at concepts.app or use the link in the show notes to give it a try. The app is free to use, and certain features are available via a subscription or a one-time payment. Again, that URL is concepts.app. Sketch, explore, and share your ideas infinitely with Concepts. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of the show. All right, Federico, we're going to cut to your interview, your one-on-one with Craig Federighi now. Stick around to the end, everybody, because we've got a couple of things we want to tell everybody about what we're going to be doing both here on AppStories and on MacStories for WWDC and over the summer. So we got a little preview there for everybody. And with that, I'll turn things over to you, Federico.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special interview segment of AppStories. Today, I am joined once again by the Senior Vice President of Software Engineering at Apple, Craig Federighi. Welcome back to the show, Craig.
Hey, thanks, Federico. Really glad to be here.
All right, so we have a lot to talk about today, especially regarding the iPad and iPadOS. I have a few questions for you. Craig has been generous enough with his time to come on the show, and that's going to be the focus of our conversation. But before we get to that, Craig, the last time we talked last year, we were in person at WWDC.
I remember.
Now, for the sake of context, obviously that's not possible right now as we're recording this remotely. I'm in Italy. You are in the United States.
Indeed.
And I just have to ask, how are you? And how have you been adjusting to all of this while continuing to work on new products and software updates at Apple?
Personally, I'm doing fine. I feel incredibly fortunate to, like many at Apple, actually, to have a role where we can continue to create, continue to work together, even though we're seeing each other on screens a lot more. We're still all working together, and it's great to have a role where we can continue to do work that seems really meaningful. And of course, getting a lot more family time too, which is something I think we'll look back on fondly through this weird time of those moments together. So actually, nothing I can complain about at all.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, I mean, been 2 months in lockdown, and just yesterday, as we record this, the Italian government started the so-called relaxed lockdown. So now we can, take a walk outside and take the dogs to the park. But I'm fine. I mean, as you said, I'm fortunate to be spending time with the family. So all things considered, I think we're doing pretty okay.
Well, good.
Now, let's talk about iPad and iPadOS, because you've been keeping busy, to say the least, I would say.
Yeah.
So in March, new iPad Pro with the announcement of a Magic Keyboard. But that wasn't all. We also got iPadOS 13.4, which is what I would like to start talking about here today. The big feature of 13.4, which I also think is a feature that, especially amongst iPad power users, we were not expecting as a sort of a mid-cycle upgrade during the year.
Felt more than a 0.1, didn't it?
Right. I mean, I don't think, honestly, any of us was expecting that. The new native pointer, the new system pointer on iPadOS. Can you elaborate on sort of what was the thinking behind the new pointer in iPadOS 13.4 and sort of what goals were you trying to achieve with it?
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. And as you might imagine, this is something we've been thinking about and working on for a long time, but it did come together in a pretty unusual time of the year, and it was actually really fun to be able to surprise people with something like this at this time. I think in terms of how we were thinking about this and the goals we were trying to achieve, we see iPad as really our most versatile device. I think from the moment we released it was, in our minds, this magical piece of glass, right? This thing that could truly become whatever you needed it to be. And though iPad has always been centered around a touch experience, one that you can hold in your hands, over time, we brought all these different forms of input to solve, to address different kinds of uses of iPad. It's natural to want to write on an iPad. It's natural to want to type and see what you're doing on your iPad. And we've done AR and now added LiDAR, so you can do AR as another form of kind of input and interaction with the world. And of course now the trackpad. And I think for years now, and you know this probably better than any, a lot of us use our iPads to type text, to work on documents as part of what we do with iPad. And you have this interaction then that tends to be focused around the keyboard. And it's in those moments that a trackpad can actually be the most ergonomic way of pointing. It's closest at hand. It provides the greatest precision. And so we want to bring, in all ways, for all different sort of modalities of interacting with an iPad, the most natural way to interact with it. And trackpad input really fit with that.
And I have to imagine that there must have been some problems and challenges you faced when designing this, right? Because it's so different from the macOS pointer, from the macOS cursor, right? And so I'm just trying to think, what were some of the problems and some of the differences that you had to consider when saying, okay, we want to bring a pointer to iPadOS, but should it behave the same way as macOS, or should it be something entirely different?
Yeah, I mean that's a really valid debate. At some level, what's the hubris to think you could improve on a design that's been refined on the Mac for over 35 years? It's been something that we've all gotten accustomed to, that's been applied so successfully to how we've interacted with Macs for so long, that at one level you'd say, well, just bring over the standard experience that people were comfortable with the Mac. But on the other hand, the iPad is a different device. It has a different feel. It has a different set of user expectations. It has a different app ecosystem that is fundamentally oriented around touch. So how do you create an experience that's perfectly native to iPad and still intuitive and meeting the expectations that you have when you sit down and start using a trackpad? And that was pretty interesting. At first, when people would sit down in front of an iPad with a trackpad, they could split into these modes where either people instantly had a whole set of Mac expectations that came to them just simply by putting their hand on a trackpad. Deep in their brain, they started thinking Mac. While other people realize I'm looking at an iPad. How should I interact with that? And so finding that balance so that it was extremely intuitive was one, but then capturing the spirit of what makes iPad was also a huge design challenge, and one that we spent a lot of time to get to where we are.
And so, for example, right now I'm recording this on a Mac, and I'm looking at the cursor, and it's an arrow. But then when I use the iPad and I look at the pointer, it's a circle, right? So it's a different design. And was that design, the circle design, sort of intended to remind you of a finger, maybe? The familiar shape interacting with the
Right.
iPadOS UI, or is it something else?
Well, almost. It's not so much that we thought of it as reminding you of a finger, but that the underlying interface of an iPad was fundamentally designed around this tool that was the pointer, and that your finger is a relatively imprecise input instrument. And those touch targets around an iOS user interface, an iPad user interface, are lower precision than Macs. We all know if you build an app for the Mac, you can tend to have smaller smaller click targets with higher precision because you're dealing with a very precise input, and the shape of the pointer on the Mac reflects that degree of precision. But on an iPad, the native level of precision is much closer to your finger, and so we wanted to reflect that in the pointer. At the same time, the iPad is an incredibly responsive and fluid user interface. Is that designed that way from the beginning, that when you begin to act with touch, we all expect the interface to move fluidly and immediately in response to our interactions. And so we wanted a shape that also could be fluid and responsive to your interaction. So it turns out that this simple circle can easily then morph into other shapes. And if you look really closely, those are these elegant animations of the Bezier of the circle into the Bezier, the form of the destination, that create this just completely fluid set of transformation. And so that shape of the circle also says, I can become anything, as well as that I have this default level of precision.
Right. It's almost as if, and maybe this is just my impression, but it's almost as if the pointer becomes sort of a UI element in and of itself, to the point where, yes, it's an external input system, right? You're using a trackpad or you're using a mouse, but also because you describe it as a dynamic pointer, right? That, as you mentioned, can morph and can become a highlighter, for example, if you're hovering over a button, or can become an I-beam if you're into a text field. It's almost as if it still remains an external input system, but it's also part of the iPadOS UI itself.
Yeah, exactly. I think you've got it. And there's also this nature that we were really trying to achieve with iPad, which was this adaptive level of precision. So the iPad in its default state, if you're touching icons on the home screen, tapping on toolbar buttons, these actually don't require a great degree of precision. And so we wanted to make interacting with those sorts of things as effortless as possible. You could sort of flick your cursor in that direction. You wouldn't have to worry exactly where the button, the pointer fell on that thing, you'd hit it, you could click. But when you went to edit text where you needed the precision, then the pointer changed its form to indicate the amount of precision you're working with. And, I think about this idea of having the right level of precision. If you were at the stand buying ice cream and you wanted to point at the ice cream you wanted, you wouldn't use a laser pointer. It feels like weirdly over-specific to draw a little beam directly at some little part of the ice cream. You're generally saying, no, that ice cream, not this ice cream, right? And so we wanted to capture that level of precision. But at the time you're editing text and you're trying to find your way between two letters, well, now you really want that level of precision. And so we really wanted to scale up from selecting whole app icons as the granularity precision, all the way down to those finer grained kinds of pointing.
And even more than that, it's not just the pointer changes shape and almost behavior, but it also almost magnetically snaps to certain UI elements. So, for example, if you're in Mail and you hover over the buttons in the toolbar, you'll see that the pointer almost snaps to the button and highlights the button. And I've been on Twitter and I've seen some pro iPad users, if you will, say, well, I'm not sure about this magnetic behavior because I don't like it that the pointer does the selection for me. So can you elaborate on sort of what was the thinking behind? But I think it's on by default actually to let the pointer. Personally, I like it, but I've seen some other people say I'm not so sure about it. And thankfully, there's a setting for that. But what was the thinking behind this magnetic behavior?
Yeah, no, that's an area we definitely put a lot of energy into refining and just a lot of tuning to it. I mean, part of it does get down to this idea that if you're making a general direction indication toward a target, that you don't want to have to be extremely precise to do that. And you don't have to worry exactly where you're hitting it. It just matters that you're generally hitting it. And so enabling you to be coarse-grained in your motion, imprecise, and yet have confidence that you're hitting the target, that you hit the target, is, I think, actually makes a lot of this interaction just sort of the effort melt away. You don't have to think about it, and it's also honestly just a kind of a joyous little thing. The little snapping and the sort of stickiness to it. We very much went through some iteration and tuning exactly how aggressive that magnetism was. I mean, I can tell you we had prototypes where we could dial it up where it almost felt like the gravitational force into a black hole. You'd be passing by some button and suddenly your cursor would just zoom over and grab itself onto a button. And that, the key was to always make sure that you felt in control, that the cursor wasn't being sort of yanked away from you. And at the same point that the visual tracking that you're accustomed to doing, we noticed that unconsciously, as you're moving a cursor across the screen, there's this steady feedback loop, somewhere in your brainstem that is saying, I'm moving here and this object is moving there, and I have an expectation of where it's going to be. And yep, I see it's heading where I think it's heading. And all of that lets you really effortlessly track. And so if we diverted from the course significantly, or if the cursor seemed to vanish into, select a large object and seemingly disappear in its pointer identity, that tracking was lost. And that was a significant issue. We played with interfaces that were using this kind of hover effect with a disappearing cursor much more aggressively, almost like an Apple TV style interface. Right. And what we found is with the complexity that you can have in iPad user interfaces with mixes of text and buttons and different layouts and so forth, and large buttons and small buttons, that you need to be able to track across all of that without thinking about it and yet land with confidence on your target. And so we made sure that if you flick the cursor, and we could project mathematically where it was going to land, and it was going to land on a button or so close to a button that we would consider a click there to be on the button, that we would just ever so slightly alter its course so that it would hit that button and land on it like you're just an amazing sharpshooter with your cursor interaction, and yet in a way that's almost imperceivable. I don't think there's any change you can make to a design as as well understood as the Max pointing design, and not get some people on Twitter to have adjustment anxiety. But honestly, I love it, and as you say, there's always a setting for everyone else.
Yeah, and it's so fun, right? It's one of those things that is just delightful. I don't know.
An iPad is fun, and it should be.
It is fun, and it's sort of it strikes that balance because maybe you do lose some of that, which is I'm actually going to ask you about this later. But direct manipulation is this idea of you see something on screen and you touch it and it does something happens. This has long been one of the iPad's greatest strengths.
Yeah.
Now with the pointer, with the cursor, at first it may seem like you do lose some of that direct interaction, and this was one of my concerns actually going into iPadOS 13.4. But then the more I used it, the more I saw how this model of the pointer and it snaps to the UI elements and it changes form, it does strike a better balance than I was expecting. So I wanted to ask you, where does it fit in on this spectrum of the iPad as a touch device that can now also be controlled with a pointer?
Well, I think what you said, balance, is so key to how we're thinking about the iPad experience, because the iPad experience is, and I think will always be, touch centric, right? iPad is a touch first experience, and that it's something you can hold in your hands and interact with directly. But it turns out this experience of pointing, indirect pointing through trackpads or a mouse, can be completely complementary to that touch experience. And we found that we can take a user experience that's designed in a touch-centric way and adapt it in a way that I think kind of without thought you can start using with the cursor. I hope your experience is like mine, that when I sit down and I've held the iPad in my hand and I've been using it in mail or in notes or whatever I'm working on, and I think I have a moment where I think, I'm going to type a bunch, and I just snap it onto my Magic Keyboard and start using it. There's no moment of reorientation, right? There's no, how do I use this thing? What's just happened to the interface? How do I interact with it now? I absolutely can pick up from where I left off without any break in my thinking. And in fact, I can continue to operate across this boundary. I can be using the trackpad, then I can reach up and scroll. And in fact, you can even do both at once. You could start a drag with the trackpad and pick up your hand and start scrolling with your finger. I mean, it's just an experience without boundary, where these different methods, I think, work together in an extremely natural way. And that's certainly what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, it's the transition between these different modes, right? Because maybe I'm sitting on the sofa and I'm scrolling through my mail messages, but then I realize, I actually want to type in something in Apple Notes, and just sit down and put the iPad into the Magic Keyboard. And so I'm transitioning between these two different modes, but the interaction doesn't feel like, as you said, I need to reconsider all my interactions. It seamlessly switches between these different modes of using the iPad.
Yeah, and this is what I find in my experience with iPad in general, that I'll be typing away, and then there'll be something, I'll follow a link somewhere to something that's maybe a bit of a longer read. And without even thinking about it, I'll just pull my iPad off, lean back in my chair, start reading, right? And then I want to type, and I just put it back. So I think that's the magic of iPad, that there's no friction for these transitions between the iPad being one way, and then you pick up the pencil and you start marking something up. You just don't even have to think about it. So that's the experience. Certainly, we're trying to create with iPad.
Mm-hmm. Which brings me to this question. Now, the more I use the pointer, the more I noticed that one specific feature that you launched in last year in iPadOS 13, context menus.
Yeah,
it sort of feels like the perfect example of a UI element that works well both with touch and the pointer, right? Because you can touch and hold, and you see the context menu, and you can keep swiping with your finger to select different items in a menu. Or now with the trackpad, whether you have a mouse or a Magic Trackpad or the Magic Keyboard, you can right click and you see a context menu. So it's the same element that scales across these different input methods. And I wonder, what are some of the considerations now and I guess going forward behind creating software that needs to work both via touch and both via the pointer?
Yeah, well, there's certainly a lot there. I agree with you about the context menus, and I think they're illustrative of how you can have an element that behaves intuitively in these different settings. They have different ways of interacting with them, and yet they feel so consistent. So you can click and hold your click and drag. And with a pointer, this can feel like the kind of interaction you might have been accustomed to with menus on the Mac. But with touch, it's a touch and hold. I think drag and drop is another interesting example where on iPad, when touching with your finger, your finger plays this dual role of being both the way you tap and also the way you scroll. Where on a trackpad, these two gestures are separated into a 2-finger gesture for scrolling and a single finger for pointing and clicking. And so in that case, we're actually in the trackpad experience able to make drag and drop even more immediate, because when you click and drag on something, there's no ambiguity as to whether you were scrolling. Right. Because we know if you were scrolling, you'd be using 2 fingers on the trackpad, but you used 1 finger and clicked and dragged. And so now we know that you're dragging. And so we can take an experience that's great on iPad and touch and actually make it exactly meet your expectations. And in some cases be even more immediate when you're interacting with it on a trackpad. And then I think the trackpad, of course, gives you other opportunities. Because I think in general, what we strive to do with the experience is take advantage of the what each kind of input modality brings to the interaction. You don't want to have some experience where you've somehow reduced all of them to the lowest common denominator. And so when it comes to a pointer has hover states. Your finger doesn't really naturally have hover states because as soon as you touch the glass, you've tapped.
Right.
But a pointer does. So take advantage of that, right? Make the iPad feel a little more responsive to your interactions on the trackpad by taking advantage of the additional information of hover and its separation from the state of tap or click. And so we're taking these common elements, but then we're thinking about them as how do you interact with them optimally with these different ways of these different tools with which you're interacting with them.
And in addition to drag and drop and clicks, you also have gestures, right? Yeah, with the Magic Trackpad, the Magic Mouse, and the Magic Keyboard for iPad Pro. You also have these new gestures that allow you to multitask more quickly and to switch between apps and open the multitasking switcher. How do these gestures? How do you feel they complement the iPad's multi-touch environment? Because again, I was very surprised when I saw, this Magic Keyboard and just even the Magic Trackpad is going to support multi-touch gestures. And I wondered, these feel like macOS gestures. I am curious to see if they will actually work in iPadOS.
Right.
And it took me 2 minutes to get used to them, basically.
Yeah.
So
I absolutely love them. Honestly, it's among my favorite things about it's sort of the greatest revelation, I think, in the iPad experience as it came together with trackpad were the multi-touch gestures. And you can go back. You could go back to some of the work we did on the Mac, but more recently with iPhone 10, we faced the challenge of rethinking the iPhone experience for a device without a home button, and this led us into this interface built around fluid gestures for sort of picking up apps and moving between them spatially or pushing them back to get back to the home screen. And of course, with iPad Pro, when we introduced the home buttonless model there, we brought that same gesture system, and it turned out it scaled wonderfully to iPad Pro. But this also gave us this perfect foundation for these multi-touch gestures that it turned out mapped gloriously well to gestures we already had in place with the Mac. And we of course went through this process of saying, for all of the gestures, we don't want to be bound by precedent and history entirely. So we always take a fresh look and say, okay, this is a new time to define a gesture set on this platform with the trackpad. What do we want these gestures to be? And of course, one of the things we try out are the kind of Mac style gestures, flick up with 3 fingers, flick left, flick right, and so forth. And what we realized is those were absolutely the most natural and intuitive and pleasant and immediate gestures for doing these multitasking gestures. And it turned out that in some ways, they're better than ever on iPad. I mean, the iPad has this incredibly fluid and responsive animation system with all reversible gestures. And then it's got 120 hertz refresh display. And so these flicks become so responsive, so effortless, so quick that in a lot of ways it feels almost more responsive to flick between apps on the trackpad with a movement of a inch with your fingers than it does to do it on the screen. So I feel like the multitasking gestures really kind of came to life in a new way with the trackpad. And yet it had this benefit that if you're used to using some of them on the Mac, they completely meet your expectations. You sit down and you know what to do.
So iPadOS now features this multiple windows, this multitasking system with slide over and split view. You have, as you mentioned, drag and drop. You have a pointer. You have gestures. And when you consider all of them together, it does feel like a relatively mature computing environment, honestly. And yet you still have, rightfully so, I think, a lot of people that say, well, I just want to use the iPad as a, if you will, simple tablet, right? I just want to hold the iPad and use it as a tablet.
Right.
But all these features for professional users, how do they influence your approach to iPadOS, and how do you keep in mind that there's going to be a spectrum of users?
Yeah, this is something we consider really deeply. With the Mac back in 1984 was certainly a breakthrough in terms of making computing accessible to a whole new audience. But when you look back on it, the Mac actually did bring a pretty substantial set of complexities that you had to master pretty much out of the gates to be successful at using the computer. I mean, there was indirect manipulation, of course, which is an overhead in and of itself for some. But you had a file system. You had folders. You had to figure out where things were and where you put them. You had multiple windows kind of by default. Like every time you opened something, you had a thing that you had to clean up. You had to master the application lifecycle of, is an app running? Should I quit it? Do I care about closing this or not, depending on the memory needs of the computer? In fact, to this day, we have iPhone users who obsessively go into the app switcher and flick away all their apps because they think they need to quit them to save memory. Because I think they were trained on a sort of pre-iOS idea of how you interact with the device. And with iPad, we've seen we took away all those barriers. You didn't have to learn anything, and that's why we see everyone from whether it's their first computer at age 1 or 2, or their first computer age 80, that they can master iPad almost immediately, right? You tap, it opens up. If you create a document, well, it's in that place where you went to create it. That's where you go get it. If you want to switch apps, you don't think about managing your real estate in your windows and closing things. You just go back home and tap on the next thing you want to do. And this is essential to iPad. And it's not just for the naive user. For all of us, we have moments where the focus that the iPad can provide, the simplicity of a single app at a time, is actually a wonderful experience to be productive or to calm the mind. And so we absolutely want to preserve that. We don't want to turn iPad into a system where moment one, you have to start thinking about managing windows, managing app lifecycle, managing documents and their file system locations. At the same time, we recognize for some users, some of the time, for some of their tasks, it's super important to be able to manage multiple documents in a joint hierarchical file system structure. It's important to be able to put content side by side or to bring over content for quick reference for multitasking. And so that's how we've approached bringing these capabilities to iOS, as one of the incremental revelation of power, and with it that additional complexity, but only for those who need it when they need it, and not all the time for everyone. And we've continued to stay true to that in our designs with multitasking on iOS, and I think now with the trackpad.
Well, that's a good answer.
Thanks. I wasn't expecting a grade.
I feel like it really encapsulates a lot of feelings that I have about the platform too. Let's talk about third-party apps. So third-party developers, in my experience, it seems like out of the box, most third-party apps worked with the pointer without requiring an update. And from what I understand is that as long as an app supports some of your native frameworks on iPadOS, you'll be able to interact with you'll be able to highlight, for example, a button in a toolbar, and it's just going to work, even if you don't necessarily update for pointer integration. However, if you're a developer and you want to optimize your app for the pointer, you can take advantage of some additional features, some additional effects. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as always, we evangelize with developers to take advantage of the native frameworks wherever they can, because when we do something like this, where we provide new capabilities in the core platform, if you're built on top of those frameworks, you get that capability for free. And so, as you say, whether it's you're using the system standard navigation bars and toolbars, or you're using the system standard text system, you get all of the behaviors with trackpad for free. Now, there are kind of two categories, I'd say, around developers who might want to do something extra. So one is where you didn't use the system frameworks. Maybe you have your own text engine, and sometimes there's a good reason for that. Microsoft Word has its own text system. It does not use the system text system. And so there's work for them to do, and they're working on a release that I think is slated for sometime soon that makes sure to adapt their text system to work well with the pointer. So they have some more work to do. There are other cases where you might have an interface where you could take more distinct advantage within the particular context of your app for the using the new pointer. So you can see that inside of what we've done inside of the iWork apps like Numbers and Keynote, where they didn't have to do this, but having in Numbers, having when you hover over cells to highlight the cell, so it's really easy to see what cell you're on, having that when you move to the boundary between cells that you get a resize cursor and can then easily adjust the width of columns. Those are the kind of things that we're used to doing pretty easily on the Mac that have been one of those things that aren't as great when using an iPad historically. And this is extra capability that's available to those apps through our pointer interaction APIs. And finally, there's the work on the kind of hover states. We support a variety of states, from a kind of rollover selection state to a raised hover state to supporting the kind of pointer magnetism that we talked about earlier. And in that case, one of the things you do have to think about before you make your control hoverable, for instance, is that its bounding box is well-defined and fits the user's mental model for the control. For instance, sometimes an app actually has a circular glyph inside of a kind of odd-shaped rectangular box. And if you choose to make that thing hoverable, you hover over that control, and what hovers is a strange square box around a round icon, which doesn't look great. And so if you do implement hovering, sometimes you have to think about the bounding box of your buttons and so forth. So all of that is available to apps that want to take it on. But as you say, I find in my experience, so much of it just works out of the box today with my iPad. So it's all upside from here.
Yeah, yeah. And do you feel like with this greater precision granted by the pointer, do you feel like it'll make it easier maybe for developers of pro apps to maybe say, well, I have this professional piece of software, and now that iPadOS also supports a pointer, maybe I can bring over some of these features, or maybe I can bring over this app to the iPad App Store. Do you think that's the end goal here?
Well, I think that a great iPad app is still one where it supports touch-centric operation. So I think there are some experiences where having that alternate pointer interaction is really elevates the experience, or is especially useful. And so I do think it opens some doors. I mean, certainly if you're writing a screen sharing application to go remote drive a Windows PC or something, I mean that software would absolutely benefit gloriously from trackpad.
Right.
But also there are cases where you have you're editing intricate vector graphics. You want to be tapping on control points really easily. You want that precision, and those tools need to support great touch interactions, but I think can become even better in the context of a trackpad, just as some apps have been enabled with Pencil, where they may have had touch interfaces, but with Pencil they really take on a whole new dimension. So I think we're going to see that for sure.
All right. So final question, Craig.
Okay.
So a decade into the iPad's life, right? It came out in April 2010, 10 years ago. It has evolved into this unique kind of computer, right? That can be a tablet, as we talked about. You can now use it sort of as a laptop. For example, if you have a Magic Keyboard, you unlock that kind of configuration. And I mean, we've seen users, right, use an iPad perhaps with an external display, perhaps with a vertical stand, perhaps with a Bluetooth keyboard, or with a Magic Trackpad. All these kinds of configurations. And I just wonder, what are your thoughts, your overall thoughts on this versatility of the iPad 10 years into its life?
Well, it sure feels to me like it's become more important than ever. I mean, I feel like computing has found its way into so many corners of our lives. Watching TV, or reading books and magazines, or writing papers, or now video chatting with our friends, or sketching, or creating music, or iMessaging. I mean, all of these things are playing different places where the iPad is now playing this role in our life, where maybe we would have used a dozen different tools in order to accomplish those same things. And so iPad, with its unique versatility, it moves around the home or the office, transitioning between those roles, becoming exactly what you need it to be for in each of those moments, for each of those activities. And it kind of allows you to transform its role almost without thought. And in that sense, I feel like iPad is becoming more and more the most natural device to play this central role in our lives. So it's been a rewarding journey.
All right, Craig, thank you so much for coming back to the show again.
Oh, my pleasure.
I really appreciate it. And thank you. And thank you for releasing the pointer much earlier than we were expecting. That was a very nice surprise.
Well, you're very, very welcome. Thanks for having me on your show.
Wow, Federico, that was a great conversation. I want to thank Craig Federighi for taking the time out of his schedule to be on the show this week. And I really appreciate him taking the time, and all the people at Apple for making this possible. So thanks to him and thanks to them. It was a fantastic conversation. I hope the listeners enjoyed it as much as I did myself. I also want to thank our second sponsor for this episode, and that's Linode. And whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Linode has the pricing, support, and scale that you need to take your project to the next level. They have 11 data centers spread throughout the world, including their latest one in Sydney, Australia. And with their enterprise-grade hardware, an S3 compatible storage option, and their next generation network, Linode delivers the performance you expect at a surprisingly good price. Get started on Linode today with a $20 credit for listeners of this show, and you'll get access to native SSD storage, a 40 gigabit network, and industry-leading processors, a revamped cloud manager built on an open source single pane app, root access to your server along with API version 4 and a Python CLI, Nanode plans starting as low as $5, and a whole lot more. Just go to linode.com/appstories and use the promo code AppStories2020 when creating a new Linode account, and you'll get a $20 credit towards your next project. Oh, and you know what? Linode is also hiring, so if you're interested in that, check it out at linode.com/careers. Once again, that URL is linode.com/appstories and the promo code AppStories2020 for that $20 credit. Our thanks to Linode for their support of the show. All right, Federico, I want to turn things over to you for a little bit of a teaser for what we're going to be working on for WWDC and this summer.
Sure. So we just heard a couple of days ago that WWDC is going to be held online only this year, starting June 22nd. So I just thought that we could share some of the plans, some of the ideas that we have for WWDC and MacStories and for later in the summer as well. So for WWDC, what you can expect from us is the usual coverage, in-depth coverage of the keynote and the State of the Union, and other big announcements from WWDC. So we're going to have the MacStories team on hand, ready to help. I'll actually be home myself this time, and instead of
we all
rushing to sessions and walking from one place to another in San Jose, I'll be just at home in front of my iPad, in front of my external display, watching the event unfold as everybody else. So we plan to have that usual coverage on MacStories with news and links and analysis and all the things that we do every year. But what we're also planning is, and I don't want to give away too much right now, but what I can say is that here on AppStories, we are planning to offer something special. You can expect some special coverage. You can expect more content from us from AppStories during WWDC and later. We're thinking about the ways that we can approach this, and then we can maybe integrate this with MacStories and with the things that I'll be working on. So definitely stay subscribed and stay tuned, because we are planning something very special here. And speaking of MacStories, what we're also planning is to do what we did last year, but do it better and do it more. So we plan to offer more iOS and iPadOS preview stories over the summer. So whatever Apple is going to end up announcing at WWDC, we are going to talk about that in the summer. We're going to do some preview stories about the next major changes to the to Apple software platforms. So you can expect that to trickle down over the summer, to see those stories from the whole MacStories team on the site. And also, in addition to that, we are also considering Club MacStories members to offer some special content for them that's related to WWDC and related to whatever developers, third-party developers, will be working on. We want to offer some of that content exclusively for Club MacStories members. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we are going to be busy, and the fact that WWDC is going to be held online is not going to change that. If anything, we are going to work even more because we're going to be home and we don't have any other excuse,
Right.
We're not in a different time zone. We're not in San Jose busy with meetups and going to live podcast recordings. We're just going to be home and we're going to be in front of our computers all day. So we want to cover WWDC 2020 well, and we want to do it right. So that's what you can expect from us. And I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think it'll be a lot of fun too. I'm really looking forward to it. This episode came out a little early compared to usual. AppStories is normally published on Mondays. So if you're new to the show, just listening for the first time, stick around because we'll have another episode out on Monday. And of course, you can find me and Federico anytime over at MacStories.net. We also write for the club. That's Club MacStories, and you can find that at club.macstories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram. He's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you Monday, Federico.
Ciao, John.